Welcome to the Monsters Among Us podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 15, The Falcon Lake Incident.
We're doing a deep dive today into a really famous Canadian case, the Falcon Lake Incident. Happened back in May '67.
Right, and we've got a fair bit to unpack here. Initial police reports, the witnesses' own accounts, investigations, lots of material.
Definitely. And it's not your typical fleeting light in the sky story, is it? We've got Steve Michalak, a lone witness.
Who claimed a very close encounter. Said he heard voices, human voices even, which is pretty unusual for these kinds of reports.
Exactly. And he sustained physical injuries. Burns, he said, came from the craft's exhaust. And interestingly, he thought it was man-made, not necessarily extraterrestrial.
Which sets it apart. And it's got this reputation, hasn't it? CBC News called it Canada's best documented UFO case. So quite a claim.
Yeah, so our goal here is really to walk through these key reports, the eyewitness stuff, and see what holds up, what doesn't, Try to understand the narrative as it unfolded.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. The very first official report. We're talking May 20th, 1967, afternoon. Constable G.A. Solotki finds Steve Michalak on the highway.
That's right, Trans-Canada Highway 1. And right away, Michalak tells Solotki to keep back. He's worried about maybe a skin disease or even radiation.
So straight off, he's indicating something highly unusual and potentially dangerous happened.
Absolutely. He's already framed the encounter in those terms.
And what did he actually tell Solotki he saw out there in the bush?
He used the words two spaceships. Said they glowed red, they were rotating. He claimed he actually touched one.
Touched it?
Yeah, and that's how his hat and shirt got wet. But interestingly, he didn't actually show the shirt burns to Solotki right then. Said the shirt was in his briefcase.
But Solotki did see the hat.
He did. He noted a burn mark on the hat, but specifically mentioned there was no burn on Michalak's head underneath.
And the marks on Michalak's skin. What was the constable's take?
Solotki's report is quite revealing there. He thought the marks on the skin looked like they could have just been from rubbing ash on himself.
So a more mundane explanation right from the start, from the officer's perspective.
Exactly. It introduces that element of doubt, or at least an alternative possibility, very early on.
And there were other things that made Solotki suspicious, weren't there? Michalak said he was prospecting.
Right, but he had no gear, no vehicle nearby, just seemed out of place. Solotki even wondered if maybe he was, hungover from the night before.
Although he didn't smell alcohol on him.
No, the report's clear on that. No smell of alcohol. But the suspicion was there. Still, Solotki offered him a ride, offered help.
Which Michalak turned down.
Yep, declined the help, said he'd take the bus back to Winnipeg, which he did. And that night, he went to the Misericordia Health Center.
And got treated for burns.
First-degree burns,
Yeah.
according to the medical report.
Okay, fast forward just 2 days. May 22nd. Michalak takes his story public. He contacts the Winnipeg Tribune.
And bam, you get that headline, I was burned by UFO, complete with Michalak's own sketch of this, classic disc-shaped object.
So what new details came out in this new paper account? Did his story change or expand?
It definitely expanded. He talked about seeing the two objects again, but this time described one landing. He gave dimensions, about 35 feet long, metallic looking.
And the details about the craft itself.
He said a door opened up. There was this bright violet light, hissing sounds. And again, he mentioned hearing voices he was sure were definitely human.
The human voices thing is just so specific. And he tried talking back.
Yeah, claimed he called out in different languages, English, Russian, Polish, German, I think trying to communicate, but got nothing back.
And then the burns happened. How did he describe that part to the press?
He said as the craft took off, he was hit by some kind of blast, maybe exhaust, that burned him in a checkerboard pattern. The article also notes his family doctor examined the burns.
And beyond the burns, he reported other physical effects too, right?
Yep.
Stuff that happened afterward.
Oh, yeah. Headaches, vomiting, apparently lost a lot of weight quickly. And this weird detail about a persistent foul smell coming from his body.
That's quite a list of symptoms. And what about the landing site itself? Did he describe finding anything there?
He claimed he found a circular area where the craft had been, said the grass and leaves were gone, like they'd been removed or destroyed by the heat.
And the undershirt. The photo of the burnt undershirt becomes pretty key evidence, or alleged evidence.
It really does, because the photos show this, it looks like a grid pattern of holes or scorch marks on the fabric.
But how does that compare to the descriptions of his actual skin burns?
That's the crucial point. The medical reports and later photos of his skin describe round and irregular shaped burns the size of a silver dollar. Blotchy. Not a neat grid like the shirt.
So a major discrepancy between the pattern on the shirt and the pattern on his body.
A huge one. It immediately makes you question how the shirt relates to the injury.
Okay, so the story's out there, the media's running with it. Naturally, authorities get involved, Canadian, American.
Right. And UFO researchers, too. On May 23rd, J.B. Thompson from APRO, that's the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, meets Michalak.
And Thompson takes photos of the burns.
Yes. And those photos, combined with the medical descriptions we just mentioned, really highlight the difference. They show these irregular, blotchy burns, not the checkerboard pattern Michalak initially described or that seemed to be on the shirt.
That inconsistency just keeps popping up. So the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they also interview him formally on the same day, May 23rd.
They do. Michalak tells him about the weight loss, the headaches, the vomiting, the symptoms he'd mentioned publicly.
And what was the RCMP officer's impression of the burns when they saw them?
Their description is interesting. They noted the burns looked more like a localized but exceptionally severe sunburn. Again, nothing about a grid.
Did Michalak explain to the RCMP why he hadn't shown Constable Salatki the burnt shirt back on the highway? Or why he was cagey about the exact location at first?
He did offer explanations. For the shirt, he said he was worried about radiation contamination, didn't want to expose Salatki.
Okay.
And for the location, he brought up a potential nickel discovery. Said he thought he'd found a valuable mineral strike nearby and wanted to keep it quiet initially, but he did offer to take them there once he felt better.
Did he show the RCMP any physical evidence during that interview?
Yes, this is when he presented the burnt cap again. Also some melted grinder goggles he said he was wearing, and of course the famous burnt undershirt.
The undershirt they tested for radiation.
That's the one. And the test came back negative for radioactivity. He also gave a partially melted glove, apparently from the encounter, to J.B. Thompson of APRO.
So a few days later, May 25th, there's a proper search. RCMP and the Air Force, air and ground.
Right.
What did they turn up?
Well, they did find some things Michalak said he'd left behind, like a shopping bag and an old saw he'd been using, but they couldn't find the actual landing spot he described. No physical evidence of a craft landing, no disturbed ground fitting the description, nothing like that.
No confirmation on the ground. And the investigation took another turn when they talked to hotel staff, right? Of Meet Kukulek's activities before the incident.
Yeah, that was May 26th. RCMP officers interviewed staff at the Falcon Hotel where Michalak had stayed, and several employees remembered him drinking beers the night before the alleged encounter, multiple beers.
Which contradicts what he'd told investigators.
Directly. He had denied drinking any alcohol before the incident on the 20th. So that adds another layer of, well, inconsistency to his overall account.
Okay, let's jump forward a bit. About a month later, June 26th, Michalak gets back in touch with the Air Force.
Right. And this time, he says he's found it. He and a friend, Gerald Hart, supposedly located the landing site.
But his attitude towards cooperating had shifted somewhat.
It seems so. He mentioned again his concerns about protecting his supposed mineral claim, but crucially, he admitted something quite significant.
What was that?
He admitted that he'd gone back to the site after being told specifically not to disturb anything, and he'd removed items.
Removed what?
His burnt outer shirt, which hadn't been seen before, and also took some soil samples from the spot.
Which obviously compromises the site for any official investigation.
Absolutely. You can't be sure what was original and what might have been introduced or altered after the fact.
And one of those soil samples he provided turned out to be interesting.
Very. Initial tests on a sample Michalak handed over came back reported as highly radioactive.
Highly radioactive. Okay, that must have set off alarm bells.
It certainly did. It led to investigators sweeping Michalak's home for any other radioactive sources, and they took the rest of his soil sample for more detailed analysis.
Did this finding make Michalak more cooperative again?
It seems that way, yeah. After the radioactivity report, he apparently became fully cooperative and agreed to lead the authorities directly to the spot he claimed was the landing site.
And when they finally got there, guided by Michalak, what did they find?
They found a semicircle where moss had clearly been scraped away or removed. And they did detect radiation, but only trace amounts, found within a crack in a rock formation there.
Trace amounts. Not highly radioactive like the first sample.
No, very low levels. And importantly, they were deemed not dangerous.
Was there any explanation for where even those trace amounts might have come from?
Yes, the chemists involved suggested a pretty plausible source. They thought the radiation was consistent with contamination from commercially available radium. You know, the stuff used in luminescent paint for watch dials and things like that back then.
So potentially just residue from something mundane, not exotic radiation from a UFO.
That was the suggestion, yes. Something readily available, which could have been introduced to the site, possibly even unintentionally or perhaps deliberately.
Michalak later published a booklet about his experience, didn't he, in 1967?
He did. My encounter with the UFO kept the story in the public eye.
And then things got even stranger in 1968, with the supposed recurrence of the burns.
Yeah, this is a really odd part of the story. In '68, Michalak claimed the burn marks had returned, and there are photos associated with this claim.
What do those photos show? Are they like the original burns?
Completely different. The 1968 photos show a grid of very uniform, small, circular marks, perfectly spaced. They look nothing like the irregular, blotchy burns documented in 1967.
That's bizarre. What did medical professionals make of those marks?
He was examined at the Mayo Clinic. A psychiatrist there assessed these later lesions, the grid marks, and concluded they were obviously factitial,
Factitial meaning?
meaning self-inflicted or artificially produced, though the psychiatrist also noted there wasn't evidence of any significant underlying mental illness.
So skepticism naturally grew around the whole case then. What were some of the main counter-theories?
Well, one prominent theory circles back to Constable Solotki's initial suspicion that maybe Michalak had some kind of accident, perhaps involving alcohol, maybe involving fire or chemicals while prospecting, and cooked up the UFO story as a cover.
Yeah, the radioactive material found later.
The theory suggests maybe that was planted afterwards, perhaps to bolster the story once the initial excitement died down or when inconsistencies started showing up.
Others have weighed in too, haven't they? Like John B. Alexander.
Yeah, he looked at it, suggested maybe an allergic reaction could explain some initial symptoms, but also heavily pointed out the major inconsistencies in Michalak's testimony over time.
And researcher Aaron Soklich also leans towards the alcohol explanation.
Yes, Soklich agrees that the idea of an alcohol-related accident or issue provides a more parsimonious explanation for many elements, especially the discrepancies between Michalak's story and Constable Solotki's initial report.
It really is a case with layers upon layers. You have the dramatic initial claim, the physical evidence like the burns and the shirt, but then all these contradictions and alternative explanations pile up.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates the challenge of investigating these kinds of extraordinary claims, especially when relying on a single witness and ambiguous physical evidence. The Falcon Lake incident remains debated because the pieces just don't quite fit neatly together.
That's the end of the episode. Until next time, keep to the shadows. Some legends are best left undiscovered.